I have marshaled aircraft onto that apron for 31 years, and in all that time I never once saw a man run the way Sergeant Halden Rourke ran across it that morning, cutting between a fuel Bowser and a baggage tug at a dead sprint, his dress boots slapping the concrete like a drumline, straight for an aircraft whose door was already swinging shut. I want to tell this properly from the beginning, because I have told pieces of it so many times over the years to my wife, to new lads on the ramp who'd heard rumors and wanted the truth of it, to a reporter I trusted, and one I did not, that I am no longer certain which details I remember and which I have simply repeated into permanence. But I was there. I watched nearly all of it from the cab of a tow tractor 40 yards off the wingtip, and later from a good deal closer than any ground crewman has business standing, and I intend to set it down the way it actually happened, not the way it got flattened into a headline by people who were never within a mile of Aldermere Field that day. My name is Callum Ashworth. I am the senior ramp supervisor at Aldermere Field, which sits 9 miles outside the capital, and serves as the joint civil and royal aerodrome for the Kingdom of Eldermore. A modest field by the standards of the great continental hubs, 3 runways, 1 terminal building of honest gray stone, and a private apron on the north side reserved for the Crown's aircraft and the handful of state and diplomatic flights that come through in a given month. I started there as a 19-year-old fuel hand the summer after I left school, and over 3 decades I worked my way up through every job the ramp has to offer: baggage, marshalling, de-icing, tug driving, and finally supervision, until I knew that stretch of concrete better than I knew my own garden. I tell you this not because I think my career is interesting, but because you should understand that when I say I had never seen anything like what happened that morning, I'm not a man given to exaggeration. I have watched kings depart in state and coffins loaded in silence, and a prime minister's aircraft diverted mid-taxi for a mechanical fault that turned out to be nothing at all. I thought I had seen the full range of what an airfield can produce. I had not. The aircraft in question was a twin-engine executive jet belonging to the Crown estate, painted a plain, unmarked white, but for a small blue crest near the tail, the kind of aircraft that moves senior members of the Royal House of Harrogate when the trip is meant to be quiet rather than ceremonial. It had been fueled and provisioned since before dawn for what the flight plan listed, in the dry language such plans use, as a private departure: 1 passenger of note, 2 attendants, a small item of registered baggage, destination a coastal township some 4 hours' flight to the south where, I would later learn, the passenger's elder sister kept a modest house above the water. On paper it was the most unremarkable thing in the world: a woman going to see her sister. The passenger of note was Queen Consort Morwenna. I had marshaled her aircraft before, more times than I could count, across the years of her marriage to King Alaric, and I want to be fair to her before I tell you what she did, because fair is what Sergeant Rourke was to her that morning when he had every excuse not to be, and if a man of his restraint could manage it, I ought to be able to manage it too, sitting here years later with nothing at stake but the truth. She was not, in my experience of her, a cruel woman or a stupid one. She was sharp-tongued with staff who bored her and warm, unexpectedly so, with the ones who earned her trust. I had seen her remember a baggage handler's daughter's name 18 months after a single conversation, which is the kind of small thing that tells you more about a person than any newspaper profile ever will. But she was also, by that point in her life, a woman who had spent the better part of 2 decades standing one step to the side of a family that the whole kingdom watched and adored, married to a king who had loved a first wife everyone still spoke of with a particular hush, stepmother in all but title to a stepson everyone was already half in love with as the future of the crown, and mother to 2 children of her own, a son, Lord Cassius, and a daughter, Lady Verena, who the public regarded, not unkindly but not warmly either, as the family's second tier. I did not know all of that at 6 in the morning when I watched Sergeant Rourke come off the perimeter road at a dead run. I have had years since to learn it, mostly from him, In the long evenings he and I have spent going back over that day, the way old men do, with the one morning of their working lives that actually mattered. What I knew at 6 in the morning was simpler. I knew that the Queen Consort's aircraft was cleared for an early departure, that it had been boarding for the better part of 20 minutes, and that the stairs crew had just radioed the tower to confirm the door was sealed. I knew that a man in the dress uniform of the King's Guard, not the ceremonial red and bearskin most people picture, but the plainer working blue the Guard wears for travel and close protection duty, still unmistakably a Guard uniform to anyone who has spent time around Harrogate, had come through the perimeter gate on foot, waved past security by an officer who plainly recognized him, and was now covering the 400 yards of open apron between the gate and the aircraft at a speed I would not have believed a man in boots and a sidearm belt could manage. And I knew, because I have spent 31 years learning to read the small signs an airfield gives off before the big ones arrive, that something had gone badly wrong somewhere between the palace and my apron, and that it was about to become my problem whether I liked it or not. I climbed down from the tug and started toward the aircraft myself, more out of animal instinct than any plan, and that is how I came to be close enough, for the whole of what followed, to see it rather than simply hear about it afterward. I have thought about that instinct a great deal since. I do not think I moved because I understood what was happening. I think I moved because 31 years on that ramp had taught me that when a King's Guard sergeant is running full out across open concrete at 6 in the morning, whatever is behind that is not something a sensible man watches from a distance. "Hold that aircraft," Rourke was shouting, before he was even within easy earshot, his voice carrying flat and hard across the apron in a way that cut straight through the engine whine of a cargo turboprop taxiing 200 yards off. "Hold the doors. Do not push back." I want to be precise about what happened in the next 90 seconds, because it is the part people ask me about most, and the part the newspapers got most wrong. The stairs crew, 2 of my own men, Denny Ockafer and a younger fellow named Ptolemy Grieve who'd been with us less than a year, heard him and froze with their hands still on the stair unit's control panel, uncertain whether to obey a shout from a running man in a Guard uniform or the departure clearance they'd already logged with the tower not 90 seconds before. That is the trouble with an airfield, and it is a trouble very few people outside this trade understand. Everything runs on sequence and clearance and radio confirmation, a whole choreography of small procedural steps that exists precisely so that nobody has to make a snap judgment call about a moving aircraft. And the moment a man comes sprinting across the concrete shouting to break that sequence, you have exactly the kind of dangerous, ungoverned moment the whole system is built to prevent. Denny, to his credit, hesitated only a second before he threw the lever that re-extended the stairs, which had already begun folding back into their housing on the tug. That 2-second decision, made by a ramp hand with 11 years' experience and no idea yet what any of this was actually about, is the reason the rest of the story was possible at all. Another 30 seconds and those stairs would have been stowed, the tug would have pulled clear, and the aircraft would have been committed to taxi. Rourke reached the base of the stairs as they finished re-extending, and he went up them 2 at a time, one hand braced on the rail, the other raised, not a threatening gesture, I want to be clear, nothing like it, but the flat, open-palmed signal a man gives when he wants everyone in view to understand he means to stop something, not to start it. The cabin door had already been secured from the inside by the moment he reached it, and he had to knock on the composite panel with the side of his fist, 3 hard raps, and call out something I could not hear from the ground but that a cabin steward later told me was simply, "Guard detail. Open the door, please. This is not a request I can withdraw." There was a pause. I remember that pause more clearly than almost anything else that happened that whole day, because it was the only quiet moment in 6 hours, a strange little pocket of stillness with an aircraft engine beginning its low pre-start whine on one side and a running man's ragged breathing on the other, and behind a 1.5 foot of composite door, a woman inside who had every reason in the world not to want to open it. The door opened. I did not hear what was said in the first exchange, standing where I was, and I have had to piece it together since from Rourke himself, and from the 2 attendants who were in the cabin, a lady's companion named Ivan Sorrel, whom I will have a good deal more to say about later, and a junior steward whose name I never learned and who left royal service within the year, understandably wanting nothing further to do with any of it. What I saw, from 40 yards off with the sun just clearing the eastern tree line and throwing long shadows across the apron, was a queen consort of Eldermore standing in the open cabin door of a Crown aircraft in a traveling coat the color of good claret, and a guard sergeant standing 1 step below her on the air stair, cap in the crook of his arm out of respect even in that moment, saying something to her in a voice too low for me to catch, and her going very still in the particular way people go still when they have just understood that the thing they had convinced themselves would work has, in fact, not worked at all. That was 6:04 in the morning. I noted the time because I had, without quite deciding to, taken out my radio log and started writing things down, a habit 31 years of shift work had made automatic in me, the moment I sensed a situation might later need an honest account from somebody who wasn't a principal in it. I did not know yet that I was about to spend the next 6 hours as an accidental witness to the strangest single morning of my working life. I only knew that whatever was happening on those air stairs was not routine, and that the small crowd already gathering along the perimeter fence, a photographer with a long lens I recognized, a handful of early travelers from the civil terminal who had wandered out to the observation rail to see what the shouting was about, 2 of my own off-duty ramp hands drifting over from the crew room with their coffee still in hand, meant that whatever was happening was not going to stay private for very much longer. I should tell you now, because you deserve to know it before I walk you through the rest, that the man with the long lens was Tobias Wren, a freelance photographer who had been working the fence line around Aldermere Field on and off for 6 years, mostly for the wire services, occasionally for the sort of tabloid that pays well for a blurry photograph of somebody important looking unhappy. I knew Tobias Wren the way you know a fox that keeps getting into your neighbor's henhouse, not fondly, but with a certain grudging respect for his persistence. He had a tip line inside the palace transport office. Everyone on the ramp knew it, though nobody could ever prove whose voice was on the other end of it. And whenever an unmarked Crown aircraft filed an early or unusual flight plan, Tobias Wren had an uncanny habit of being at the fence with his lens already screwed on before the ground crew had finished the pre-flight checks. He had been there since before 5 that morning, which told me, retroactively, that word of the Queen Consort's departure had gone somewhere it was never supposed to go, sometime the night before. I did not know yet what she was carrying. Nobody on the ramp did, not at 6:04. We knew a woman was refusing, or hesitating, or arguing, at the top of a set of air stairs with a guard sergeant who had run the length of the apron to reach her before the door sealed. That in itself would have been the strangest thing I had witnessed in a working life spent watching very ordinary departures happen very ordinarily, day after day, year after year. I had no idea it was only the opening minute of something that would end up on the front page of every newspaper in the kingdom, discussed in Parliament, and remembered. I am fairly confident of this now, for as long as anyone tells stories about the royal house of Harrogate at all. To understand what Sergeant Rourke was doing on those air stairs, and why, you have to go back a little further than 6:04 that morning. You have to go back, in fact, to a woman who had already been dead the better part of a year. Rosalind, the Queen Mother, King Alaric's own mother, who had died the previous autumn at the age of 81, after a long illness the whole kingdom had followed with the particular tender attention a nation gives its most beloved elder, and whose estate, her private property, as distinct from anything belonging to the crown itself, had been sitting for 11 months in a legal and procedural limbo that almost nobody outside the palace's own administrative offices understood or cared about. Right up until the morning it exploded across an airfield in front of a photographer with a very long lens. I did not know Queen Mother Rosalind personally, of course. Men like me do not sit at the tables where Queen Mothers sit. But I had marshaled her aircraft dozens of times over the years, watched her come down her own airstairs slowly in her last seasons with a hand on a lady's maid's arm, and still find, every single time, a moment to stop and say something kind to whichever ground crewman happened to be standing nearest the bottom step. She once told me, I want to say it was 9 or 10 years before she died, that she had grown up not far from an airfield very much like this one, watching the old propeller aircraft come and go, and that some part of her had never stopped finding the whole business of flight faintly miraculous. I remember that conversation because it lasted perhaps 90 seconds and I thought about it, on and off, for years afterward. She was that kind of woman. People loved her the way you love a grandmother rather than the way you admire a monarch, and when she died, the kingdom mourned her with a depth of feeling that surprised even the palace's own communications office, or so I was told later by people who would know. She left behind, among a great many other things, a modest but exquisite personal collection of jewelry and family heirlooms, pieces that had come to her over 60 years of marriage and motherhood and public life, some inherited, some given to her by King Alaric's late father, one or two commissioned by her own hand in her middle years, when she developed, by all accounts, a genuine passion for the stonecutter's and goldsmith's craft. The most significant of these, a sapphire pendant on a platinum chain that the family had for 2 generations called simply the Harrogate Star, was valued not for its size. It was not the largest stone in the crown's broader holdings by any measure, but for what it represented. It had been Rosalind's own mother's before it was hers, a piece that had traveled through 3 generations of women in that family entirely outside the formal machinery of crown jewels and state regalia. A private thing, a family thing, precisely the kind of object that means everything to the people who love it and nothing at all to a public that has never heard its name. Rosalind's will, drafted years before her final illness and updated only lightly near the end, had left the bulk of her personal estate, property, funds, the greater portion of her jewelry, in terms that were, by the account of everyone who later described the document to me, entirely clear and entirely conventional. To King Alaric, to be administered and eventually distributed according to family tradition, and the Crown Estate Office's standard probate process, which in a kingdom like ours, with property and heirlooms tangled up across public trusts and private family holdings going back centuries, could reasonably take a year or more to fully untangle even when nobody contested a single line of it. The Harrogate Star specifically had no separate instruction in the will at all. It was simply part of the estate, awaiting the same slow, careful, entirely unglamorous process of inventory and authentication and eventual distribution that the rest of the collection was awaiting. And this is the part I did not understand until much later, the part that turns this from a simple story about a woman who tried to steal some jewelry into something a good deal sadder and more human than that. Queen Mother Rosalind had, in the last spring of her life, said something to Queen Consort Morwenna in a private conversation that no one else witnessed, and no one else could later confirm or deny. I am going to tell you what I eventually came to believe happened in that conversation, based on everything I have since learned from Sergeant Rourke. From a Crown Estate Registrar I will introduce you to shortly, and though I never expected to be in a position to say this, from a handful of things the Queen Consort herself said to me directly, months after the events of that morning, in a conversation I still find remarkable that she chose to have with a man who marshals aircraft for a living. I do not say any of it as established fact, because it cannot be established as fact. That is precisely the trouble the whole affair turned on. I say it as the truest account I am able to give. Rosalind, in her last months, had grown close to Lady Verena, the Queen Consort's daughter, then 24 years old, engaged to be married within the year to a young naval officer the family liked very much in a way that surprised the household, since Rosalind's warmest attentions during her long life had generally, and understandably, gone to her own blood, to King Alaric, to Crown Prince Rowan, to Rowan's small children. But something in Verena's quiet, unshowy devotion during Rosalind's final illness. She had visited nearly every week of that last year, read to her when her eyes tired, sat with her through 2 hospital stays without ever once being photographed doing it, because she had asked the household staff specifically not to let word out, had earned her a genuine and particular tenderness from the old woman. And somewhere in one of those quiet visits, holding the sapphire at her own throat the way she often did when she was tired, Rosalind had apparently said something to the effect that she wanted Verena to have it. Not the whole estate, not a public declaration. Just that one piece, the star, passed privately, mother to almost granddaughter, the kind of quiet promise elderly women make to the young people who have been kind to them at the end. She never wrote it down. She never mentioned it to King Alaric or to her solicitor or to anyone at all except, so far as anyone could ever determine, Queen Consort Morwenna, to whom she is believed to have repeated the sentiment once, gently, a few weeks before she died, in a conversation Morwenna would later describe to me, of all people, on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon nearly a year after the fact, as the single kindest thing anyone in that family had ever said to her. She didn't even really need to tell me, Morwenna said to me, that afternoon, in a tone I still remember for how tired it sounded, tired in a way that had nothing to do with the hour of day. I think she told me because she knew I would actually do something about it. Everyone else in that family moves so slowly, Mr. Ashworth. They convene committees. They wait for lawyers. Rosalind knew that if she wanted Verena to have that stone before Verena's own wedding, she couldn't leave it to the estate office and a probate calendar. She had to leave it with someone who would simply make sure it happened. I am getting ahead of my own story, telling you a conversation that took place months after the morning I am meant to be describing. But I think you need to understand, before I take you back to those air stairs, that whatever else happened that day, Queen Consort Morwenna was not a jewel thief in any sense a reasonable person would recognize. She believed, rightly or wrongly, and I have come to think it was somewhere in between, a private wish half remembered and half reshaped by a grieving woman's own hopes over 11 long months, that she was carrying out a dying woman's last quiet request for a daughter who had earned it through a year of unrecorded kindness. She was not smuggling the Harrogate star out of the kingdom to sell it or hide it. She was taking it, without authorization, to have it properly reset by a jeweler her sister knew on the southern coast, in secret, so that she could present it to Verena at her wedding in 3 weeks' time as a gift from a grandmother who would not live to give it herself. It was, I have come to believe, an act of love clumsily and unlawfully executed by a woman who had spent 2 decades learning that the family she'd married into moved with a caution that could feel, from the inside, indistinguishable from indifference. None of which changed the fact that what she was doing, at 6:04 that morning, standing in the open door of a Crown aircraft with an unauthorized item from a contested estate in a locked case at her feet, was against the law, against Crown estate procedure, and about to become the most public embarrassment the royal house of Harrogate had suffered in a decade. I need to take you back one more step, to the night before, because the argument that sent her running for that aircraft did not come out of nowhere, and Sergeant Rourke himself did not learn about any of what I have just told you until he was already standing on those air stairs with his hand raised for calm. He ran across that apron knowing almost none of it. He ran because a registrar named Adeline Fay had woken him at 4:30 in the morning with a discrepancy in a vault ledger that, followed to its logical conclusion, meant a national scandal was boarding an aircraft in 90 minutes, and he had exactly enough time to reach the field before the doors sealed, and not 1 minute more to understand why. I will tell you about that phone call, and about the argument at Harrogate the evening before it, because I think you cannot understand the calm, careful, almost gentle way Sergeant Rourke handled everything that followed without understanding how little he actually knew when he started running, and how much of what makes this a story worth telling is the fact that he did not need to know the whole of it to handle it correctly. That, more than anything else, is what I came to admire about the man over the years I got to know him afterward. He did not wait for the full picture before doing his duty. He simply did his duty calmly and correctly, and let the full picture arrive in its own time. The argument at Harrogate happened the previous evening, in King Alaric's private study on the second floor of the palace's older wing, a room I have never set foot in myself, but which Morwenna described to me, months later, in enough detail that I feel I could draw its floor plan. Heavy curtains the color of dark wine, a portrait of Rosalind above the mantel that had been hung there within a week of her death, and that Morwenna said she found it very difficult to sit in that room and not look at. She had gone to Alaric that evening to ask, directly and formally, that the Harrogate Star be released to her ahead of the rest of the estate's probate, citing Rosalind's private wish and Verena's approaching wedding as reasons for urgency. Alaric, by every account I have ever heard, was not unkind about it. He was tired. The kingdom had buried his mother less than a year before, and the slow work of settling her estate was, for him, a grief he had to relive in small administrative doses every time a new form crossed his desk. And he told her, gently but without any real room for negotiation, that he could not simply hand a contested piece of his mother's estate to anyone, including his own wife, on the strength of an unwitnessed private conversation. No matter how much he wanted to believe it had happened exactly the way she described. He reminded her, not cruelly, that the estate office had procedures for precisely this situation, a claims process, a hearing before the family's own solicitors, a path that existed to protect everyone, including Verena, from exactly the kind of public doubt that would attach itself to a stone handed over informally and without record. He told her the process could very likely be expedited if she simply filed the claim formally, in writing, with the registrar's office, that very week. It was good advice. It was correct advice. It was also, to a woman who had spent that whole difficult year feeling like the family's most important decisions were made in rooms she was invited into only after the fact, precisely the wrong thing to hear the night before her daughter's dress fitting, 3 weeks before the wedding, on the anniversary. Though I do not think Alaric remembered this, and I do not think she told him of her own mother's death, 22 years before. She did not shout. Nobody I ever spoke to described her raising her voice in that study. She left the room, went to her own apartments, and by all accounts spent a long while simply sitting with the idea before she acted on it, which is, I think, the detail that most separates what she did from anything cartoonish or villainous. This was not a tantrum. It was a slow-burning, deliberate, entirely wrong-headed decision made by an exhausted woman at the end of a very long grief, and by midnight she had told her lady's companion, if in sorrow, to arrange a private flight to her sister's for the following morning, and sometime after that. The exact hour was never fully established, though Adeline Fay's ledger eventually placed it close to 2 in the morning. She went down, alone, to the lower vault where a portion of Rosalind's estate was being held pending inventory, using an access she still held from her years as a trustee of the Queen Mother's household accounts, and she took the Harrogate Star. She left a note. I want you to know that, because it is not the detail of a woman trying to get away with something. She left a note in the vault ledger book itself, in her own hand, stating what she had taken and why, and that she intended to have it properly logged and returned to formal process the moment it was reset for Verena's wedding. It was, in its way, the most honest theft I have ever heard of, and it was also the single piece of evidence that made the whole affair impossible to keep quiet, because Adeline Fay found that note at half past 4 the following morning during a routine early check she had no reason to expect would turn up anything at all. And a registrar who finds a queen consort's handwritten confession in a vault ledger does not have the luxury of deciding, on her own authority, to simply say nothing. Adeline Fay did the only thing a woman in her position could reasonably do. She woke her direct superior in the estate office, who woke the captain of the guard, who in turn placed a call to the one sergeant on the duty roster he knew could reach Aldermere Field inside the hour, and who could be trusted, above every other quality the guard values in its men, to handle whatever he found there without making it worse. That sergeant was Halden Rourke, and he was already awake. In the small rented house he kept a 15-minute drive from the palace, because his infant daughter had woken him 20 minutes before the call came in anyway, and he was standing in his kitchen with the child on his shoulder and a kettle just beginning to whistle when his radio crackled with an order that gave him almost no information beyond a flight number, a departure time, and 4 words that he told me, years later. He had never forgotten: unauthorized estate item moving. He was in his uniform in 4 minutes. His wife had the baby, and he made the drive to Aldermere Field, a drive that should have taken 25 minutes at that hour, in 17, leaving his car half onto the verge at the perimeter gate because he judged, correctly, that the last 400 yards would be faster on foot than waiting for a guard vehicle to be summoned and cleared through the gate procedure. He did not know, when he started that run, whose item it was or what it was worth, or why a woman he had guarded at a respectful distance for years would suddenly be smuggling family jewelry onto a departing aircraft. He knew only that something belonging to the Crown estate was leaving the kingdom without authorization, that it was moving right now, and that his entire training, his whole career, everything the guard had spent 12 years teaching him, pointed to exactly one correct response: reach it before it left, and handle whatever he found there with more calm than the situation seemed to deserve. That is the man who came up those air stairs at 6:04 in the morning, cap in the crook of his arm, breathing hard, facing a queen consort of Eldermore who had just realized, in the space of about 4 seconds, that 11 months of careful, private, grief-soaked planning had come apart in front of a photographer with a very long lens. "Ma'am," he said to her, "I have this from Yvonne Sorrel, who stood just behind Morwenna in the cabin doorway and heard every word. I have an urgent hold from the estate office on an item logged as removed from the Queen Mother's inventory without authorization. I am required to ask you to remain aboard and to allow me to verify the manifest before this aircraft is cleared to depart. I would very much prefer to do that quietly here, rather than any other way this could go." I did not hear those words myself, not that morning, but I have turned them over enough times since, in Rourke's own retelling and in the accounts of everyone else who was close enough to hear them, that I could probably say them in my sleep. And I want you to notice what he did not say. He did not say her name in a way that made it a public accusation. He did not order her off the aircraft in front of the growing crowd at the fence line. He did not so much as raise his voice above the level a man uses to be heard over an idling engine. He offered her, in the very first sentence he spoke to her that morning, the one thing that mattered most and that he had absolutely no obligation to offer: the chance to do this quietly. She did not take it, not yet, and that refusal, hers, not his, is where the real chaos of that day began. "There has been a misunderstanding," she told him, and Yvonne Sorrel said afterward that her voice was perfectly level, the voice of a woman who has spent 20 years learning to sound, composed no matter what is happening underneath. "I am visiting my sister. I do not know what item you believe has gone missing, Sergeant, but I assure you nothing has left this kingdom without proper authority. It was, Rourke told me once, the only time in the whole affair that he came close to losing his own composure, not from anger but from something closer to sympathy, because he could hear in the careful construction of that sentence, 'Nothing has left this kingdom,' present tense, technically still true with the aircraft still on the ground, A woman trying to talk her way past a fact she already knew was lost. He did not call her on the wording. He simply held his ground, one step below her on the air stair, and said that he understood she had a flight to make, that he had no wish to delay her longer than necessary, and that the fastest way through this was to allow him to see the manifest and the item in question, so that the matter could be resolved before it became any larger than it needed to be. I think it is worth pausing here to say something about what Sergeant Rourke was actually risking by pressing the point rather than simply standing aside. He was, in that moment, a sergeant, not even the most senior man in his own detail, asking a queen consort of Eldermore to submit to a search of her own luggage on the strength of a 4:30 phone call and a ledger entry he had not personally seen. If he was wrong, if this turned out to be some clerical mix-up rather than the theft it plainly was, his career would very likely have ended that morning, and not gently. The Guard does not reward men who publicly embarrass a member of the royal house over a misunderstanding. He had every institutional incentive in the world to hesitate, to ask for confirmation from a superior, to let the aircraft go and sort the paperwork out afterward the way most men in his position would have chosen to do. He did not hesitate because, and this, more than anything else, is the thing I have come to admire most about him across the years I've known him since. Halden Rourke had built his entire career on the belief that correctness, applied evenly and without exception regardless of who stood on the other side of it, was the only thing that actually protected the crown he served. He told me once, over a beer at a pub 2 miles from the field, long after he'd made captain, that the easiest lie a guard can tell himself is that the rules bend a little for the people at the top, because those people are important, because embarrassing them costs more than the rule is worth. The whole job falls apart the day you believe that, he said. The moment the rule only applies to the people who can't push back, it isn't a rule anymore. It's just a stick for beating on the powerless. I did not fully understand, when he first said that to me, how directly he was describing the exact choice he'd made on those air stairs. I understood it a good deal better later. By 6:10, word had reached the crew room, and by 6:15 it had reached me directly, over the radio, in the flat, unhelpful language ground control uses when nobody yet knows what they are dealing with. Ashworth, hold all North Apron movement, guard directive, out. I acknowledged it and kept walking toward the aircraft, close enough now to see the shape of things without hearing the words, and I remember thinking, with the particular selfish clarity of a man whose whole working life runs on schedules, that whatever this was, it was going to back up the entire morning's North Apron traffic, and that I had better start figuring out where to divert the 2 aircraft already inbound behind it. That thought did not survive contact with what I saw next. Tobias Wren, at the fence 200 yards off, had his lens up and was firing off frames at a rate that told me, even from that distance, that he understood exactly what he was looking at even if I did not. A guard sergeant blocking a queen consort's departure in full view of the observation rail, at an hour when there should have been nobody at all to see it. Word travels along an airfield fence faster than almost anywhere else I have ever worked, because everyone standing there is already watching, already waiting, already primed to notice anything out of the ordinary the way you notice a single wrong note in a familiar song. Within 10 minutes, there were perhaps a dozen people at the rail who had not been there at 6 o'clock, drawn by nothing more than the sight of other people looking intently in one direction, which is, I have found, the single most reliable way to gather a crowd anywhere in the world. By 6:20, Ptolemy Grieve came jogging over to where I stood and told me, in the breathless half-whisper of a young man who has just heard something enormous and does not yet know what to do with it, that Denny had overheard one of the cabin crew say the word jewelry into a hushed phone call from the galley, and that somebody, nobody could later say for certain who, had already placed a call to a stringer at the capital's largest paper. I want to stop here and say something about how fast these things move, because I do not think people who have not worked around a public institution under public scrutiny fully appreciate it. It took perhaps 20 minutes, start to finish, for a private, quiet, entirely internal matter, a registrar's ledger, a phone call, a sergeant's private conversation on a set of air stairs, to become a story with its own momentum, gathering its own crowd, generating its own photographs, entirely independent of what anyone directly involved wanted or intended. By the time King Alaric himself learned what was happening at Aldermere Field, which was not until nearly 6:40, Tobias Wren had already transmitted 4 photographs to an editor in the capital. And the story, in the sense that actually matters, the sense of being a thing now loose in the world that nobody could fully call back, was already written. Inside the cabin, the standoff had not moved an inch in either direction. Rourke had not entered the aircraft. He told me later that he judged, correctly, that stepping inside without invitation would read as far more aggressive than anything he'd said, and that the open cabin door, with him standing 1 step below it, gave the Queen Consort a form of dignity, the appearance, at least, of still being in command of her own aircraft, that he thought worth preserving as long as it did not compromise the hold itself. Morwenna, for her part, had not produced the case. She had, according to Ibn Sorrel, simply repeated some version of her opening claim 3 or 4 times in 3 or 4 different phrasings, each one a little less convincing than the last, while the junior steward stood frozen by the galley, wondering whether his career had just ended, and Ibn herself grew steadily more certain that this was not going to end the way her mistress hoped. It was Ibn, in the end, who broke the impasse, and I think that detail matters enough that I want to give her a proper place in this account rather than let her disappear into an attendant, as most of the newspaper coverage did. Ibn Sorrel had served as Morwenna's companion for 6 years by that point, hired originally as a lady's maid but promoted, through evident competence and evident loyalty, into something closer to a private secretary and confidant. She had helped arrange the flight the night before on Morwenna's direct instruction, had known exactly what was in the locked case at her mistress's feet, and had spent the drive to the airfield that morning with a slowly rising dread that she told me, years later, she had not had the courage to voice aloud in the car. "Ma'am," she said at 6:22, quietly enough that only Morwenna and Rourke could hear it, "I think we should simply show him." There was a silence on those air stairs that I imagine must have felt very long to the 3 people standing in it, though it can only have been 4 or 5 seconds by any clock. And then Queen Consort Morwenna, who had built a public reputation over 2 decades for being unflappable in exactly the situations designed to flap a person, bent down, picked up a slim leather case from the cabin floor, and held it out to Sergeant Halden Rourke, not thrown, not shoved, but extended with a steadiness in her hand that Rourke told me he found more affecting than any amount of shouting could have been, because he understood, watching her do it, that this steadiness was costing her everything she had left that morning. "It is not what you think," she said, as he took it. "I need you to understand that before this goes any further. It is not what you think." He did not open the case there, on the air stairs, in front of a fence line that now held perhaps 30 onlookers and a photographer whose shutter had not stopped clicking in 10 minutes. I want you to notice that, because it is the first of a dozen small decisions he made that morning that nobody praised him for at the time, and that I think, looking back, were the whole substance of what made him extraordinary rather than merely competent. A less careful man would have opened it right there, would have wanted the confirmation, would have wanted the crowd and the cameras to see him vindicated. He closed his hand around the case, thanked her quietly, and told her that he was required to verify its contents with the estate office before any further step could be taken, and that he would very much prefer to do that inside the terminal, away from the fence line, rather than standing on an open air stair in front of a growing audience. "Will you come with me, ma'am?" he said. "Or would you prefer to wait aboard while I make the call?" It was, I have come to understand, an unusually generous question for the situation. He had at that point more than enough grounds to simply order her off the aircraft and detain her formally, and no one, not the estate office, not the captain of the guard, not even, I suspect, King Alaric himself, had he been standing there, would have faulted him for it. Instead, he offered her a choice, the smallest possible scrap of control over a morning that had otherwise been stripped entirely out of her hands, and I think it was that offer, more than the case itself, that finally broke through whatever composure she had left. She came down the air stairs on her own 2 feet, unassisted, chin level, and I remember watching her do it from 40 yards off and thinking that whatever this woman had done, she was not going to give the fence line the satisfaction of seeing her stumble. The walk from the aircraft to the terminal building took perhaps 90 seconds. It felt, to everyone watching from the rail, very much longer than that, and it is the 90 seconds that ended up in one grainy long-lens photograph that ran on 3 separate front pages by the following morning, as the single image most people in the kingdom now associate with the entire affair. A queen consort in a claret traveling coat, flanked by a guard sergeant holding a slim leather case, crossing an open apron in the low gold light of a summer morning, neither of them looking at the camera. Both of them, in their own very different ways, doing everything they could to hold themselves together in front of it. I did not know, watching that walk from the cab of my tug, that the morning was only just beginning. Aldermere Field has a small suite of rooms behind the civil terminal's 2nd floor that we call, with more grandeur than the space deserves, the State Lounge, 3 connecting rooms with decent furniture and a view of the apron, kept for exactly this kind of situation, when someone important needs somewhere private to wait that is not a public departure gate. I was not permitted inside it that morning, and for a long while I knew only what filtered back to the ramp second-hand, in the disjointed, half-accurate way information travels through an airfield when everyone is busy and no one has the full picture. But I have since had the whole of it from Sergeant Rourke himself, told to me slowly over several evenings, years after the fact, when enough time had passed that he no longer needed to guard every word of it, and I am going to tell it to you now the way he told it to me. He took Morwenna and Ivan into the smallest of the 3 rooms, asked the duty officer to hold the other 2 clear, and placed a call to Adeline Fay at the estate office using the terminal's secure line rather than his own radio, which anyone with a scanner along the fence could have been listening to by then. Fay picked up on the first ring. She had not slept, and she would tell me herself much later that she had spent the 2 hours since her 4:30 discovery composing and recomposing the sentence she would use to describe what she'd found, terrified that whatever she said next might end her career, or worse, might be the thing that finally broke something in the royal house that a whole kingdom had spent a difficult year trying to hold together. "I have the item," Rourke told her. "I need you to confirm what the ledger says was removed, and I need you to be exact." There was a pause on the line, Rourke told me, long enough that he wondered if the call had dropped. Then Adeline Fay read out, in the flat, careful voice of a woman reading from a document rather than speaking her own words, the entry she had found in the vault ledger at 4:30 that morning, written in a hand she recognized immediately, because she had spent 11 months processing Queen Mother Rosalind's estate and had grown intimately familiar with every signature connected to it. Removed this date, 1 sapphire pendant on platinum chain, catalog number 114 known as the Harrogate Star, she read. Signed M. Rourke opened the case, there in the small room with Morwenna and Ivan watching, and found exactly that, a sapphire pendant on a platinum chain, wrapped in a soft cloth, resting in a case lined with worn velvet that had clearly held it, or things like it, for a great many years before that morning. He held it up to the light for a moment. He told me, not out of any real doubt, but because some part of him needed to see with his own eyes that the whole of that frantic morning had come down to one small, beautiful, entirely human thing, and not to something larger or darker than that. "This matches," he told Faye, and something in the room eased all three of them, he said, in the same instant, as if a held breath had finally been allowed out. Morwenna, for the first time since the air stairs, sat down. "I want to tell you honestly that for perhaps 20 minutes, in that small room behind the terminal, everyone involved believed the worst of it was over." Rourke told me, he began, almost immediately, composing in his head the shape of the report he would file: an unauthorized removal, self-disclosed by the party responsible in the ledger itself, item recovered intact within 4 hours, no loss to the estate, the whole matter resolvable as an internal estate office question rather than anything that needed to touch a magistrate or a courtroom. He believed, and I do not think it was naive of him to believe it, that the hardest part of his morning was behind him, and that what remained was paperwork, and perhaps an uncomfortable conversation with his own captain about why he'd made the call he'd made, but nothing more dangerous than that. Queen Consort Morwenna, sitting in a low chair with her traveling coat still buttoned, allowed herself, Iving told me later, the first full breath she had taken since 2 o'clock that morning, and began quietly to explain to Rourke, not because she had to, not because he demanded it, but because the silence in the room seemed to require it of her, why she had done it. She told him about the Sapphire's history, about Rosalind's private words to her in the last spring of her life, about Verena's quiet unphotographed devotion through that long final illness, about the wedding 3 weeks away and the dress fitting that had happened, of all things, the very afternoon before, and about a conversation with her husband the previous evening that had left her feeling, in her own words, like a stranger asking permission to love my own daughter properly. Rourke listened. He did not interrupt her, did not caution her that anything she said could be used against her, did not treat the moment as an interrogation, because he told me this very plainly years later, and I have never forgotten it. He had already decided, somewhere in the run across that apron, that his job that morning was to stop a mistake from becoming irreversible, not to punish a grieving woman for the shape her grief had taken. "She wasn't a criminal to me," he said. "She was a woman who'd made a bad decision at 2 in the morning after a hard conversation, the kind of decision plenty of people make, and are lucky enough that nobody ever finds out. She just happened to be the sort of person whose bad 2 in the morning decisions come with a photographer at the fence. It is here, in that small room, 20 minutes into what everyone in it believed was the beginning of a resolution, that the telephone rang again, and Adeline Faye's voice, when Rourke picked it up, had changed entirely from the careful, steadying tone of the first call. "Sergeant," she said, "I need you to sit down if you're not already." He was not sitting down. He told me he stood very still instead, the way he'd been trained to stand very still through worse news than this over 12 years of service, and asked her to go on. "I went back through the ledger properly, start to finish, once I had a moment to breathe," Faye said. "I was not thorough enough the first time, Sergeant. I was frightened and I was tired, and I found the one entry and I called your captain before I'd finished reading the whole page. There is a second entry, same night, same vault. A different item." The second entry, she told him, was for a small object catalogued as item 226. A gold pocket watch, plain but old, that had belonged not to Rosalind's own jewelry collection at all, but to her late husband, King Alaric's father, a piece that had passed to Rosalind on his death decades before and remained, ever since, one of the few purely sentimental objects in the whole of the estate, not valuable in the way the star was valuable, worth perhaps a few thousand crowns to a jeweler, but irreplaceable in every way that actually mattered to the family that had kept it wound and ticking on a bedside table for 2 generations. The entry beside it, unlike the first, was not signed with a careful, deliberate M and an explanation. It read only, "Taken," and beneath that, in a different, hastier hand, a single word that Faye read out to Rourke with what he described as visible reluctance, because she understood exactly what it would do to the room she could not see. Cassius. I remember, when Rourke first told me this part of the story, feeling something click into place that I had not expected. The sense that this was not, after all, a simple story about one woman's grief-driven mistake, but something with a second thread running quietly underneath it the whole time, one that none of us on the ramp, watching an aircraft and a photographer and a queen consort's careful walk across open concrete, had had any way of knowing about. Lord Cassius, Morwenna's son, was 28 years old that summer, and by most public accounts a pleasant, unremarkable young man who had never sought, and had mostly avoided the sharper edges of royal scrutiny that fell so heavily on his stepbrother Rowan, and increasingly on his own sister Verena. He held no formal role in government, drew a modest private income from a family trust, and had, in the 18 months before that morning, made a series of private investments. In a shipping concern, 2 of his university friends had started, in a small vineyard on the southern coast, in a restaurant venture that had folded within its first year, that had gone badly enough, and quietly enough, that almost no one outside his own household staff and his bank knew the scale of what he owed. He had gone to the same vault, using an access he had held since he was a young man, helping catalog his grandmother's collection as a family courtesy years before her death. At some point that same night, the ledger placed it perhaps an hour after his mother's own visit, though neither of them, as it turned out, had had the faintest idea the other was there, and had taken his late grandfather's pocket watch, intending, Rourke would learn within the hour, to sell it quietly through a discreet dealer in the capital, to cover the most pressing of his debts, before his creditors did something that would embarrass the family a great deal more than a missing pocket watch ever could. He was not at that moment at Aldermere Field. He was, so far as anyone yet knew, at his own residence in the capital, entirely unaware that his mother's flight had been stopped, that a guard sergeant now held physical possession of a sapphire she had also taken from the same vault that night, or that within the hour his own name was going to be read aloud, in a small room behind a terminal building, by a woman he had never met. I want to be honest with you about what this second discovery did to the morning, because it is the point at which what had been, until then, a difficult but essentially containable family matter became something closer to what the newspapers would eventually call it, a genuine institutional crisis, the largest the royal house of Harrogate had faced in a decade, and the reason the word chaos is not, in my judgment, too strong a word for what Aldermere Field became over the following 3 hours. Because it was at almost exactly that moment, 6:50 in the morning, by my own log, that the first bulletin appeared on the capital's largest news service, filed by an editor who had received 4 photographs from Tobias Wren 40 minutes earlier, and had spent that time trying, and failing, to reach anyone at the palace willing to confirm or deny what they showed. The bulletin was cautious, by the standards of what would follow it within the hour, but it was already enough to change everything. Queen Consort halted before departure at Aldermere Field. Guard seizes case. Palace silent. By 7 o'clock, that single cautious sentence had become the most shared item in the kingdom. I felt the change on the ramp before I understood its cause. Aldermere Field runs, on an ordinary weekday morning, 3 or 4 civil departures and arrivals an hour on top of whatever crown or diplomatic traffic is scheduled, a rhythm so familiar to me after 31 years that I can usually tell you what's happening on the field with my eyes closed, from the sound of it alone. That morning, a little after 7, the rhythm broke. My radio, which normally carries the calm, clipped, entirely unremarkable traffic of tower and ground control managing routine movements, began filling instead with a different kind of chatter. Requests from the terminal's front curb for additional parking capacity, a call from our own security office asking whether we had the staff to hold the public car park, and then, unmistakably, the low, continuous grumble of engines that were not aircraft engines at all but the diesel rumble of television vans, 4 of them within 20 minutes, pulling up along the access road, outside the perimeter fence with their masts beginning to rise. I want to try to convey what an airfield looks like when it becomes, without warning, the most interesting place in the entire kingdom for 3 hours. It does not look like a riot. It does not look from a distance like very much at all a fence line, a scatter of parked vans, a growing crowd of people standing with phones and cameras raised, mostly quiet, mostly still, the particular stillness of a crowd that is watching and waiting rather than moving. But it does something to the ordinary function of a place like mine that is very hard to describe to someone who has not lived through it. Every decision that would normally take 30 seconds, where to park an incoming aircraft, whether to open a second security lane, how to route the delayed 915 to its stand without crossing an area the guard had cordoned, now took 5 minutes, because every decision had to be checked against a security picture that was changing by the quarter hour. By 7:30, I had 4 aircraft holding on the taxiway with nowhere useful to send them, 40-some passengers stranded in the civil terminal with a departure board that had stopped making sense to any of them, and a security office that had, on Captain Bell's direct order, closed the entire north apron to anyone without guard clearance, which meant, among a great many other inconveniences, that I personally could no longer reach my own tug without a fresh pass being issued at the gate. I do not say any of this to complain about my own morning, though it was, professionally, one of the worst mornings of my career. I say it because I think the sheer physical, mechanical disruption of it, the delayed flights, the stranded travelers, the vans and the masts and the growing crowd along a fence that on an ordinary day drew perhaps 6 or 7 aircraft spotters with long lenses, and nothing more dramatic to photograph than a cargo turboprop, is the part of that morning that the word chaos was built for, and it had almost nothing to do with anything Sergeant Rourke did or said. He was, through all of it, the single calmest man on that entire field. The chaos belonged to everyone else. Captain Osric Bell arrived at the field a little before 7, having been woken at his own home by the same call chain that had reached Rourke an hour earlier, and I am told, again, second-hand, though from a source I trust, that his first act on reaching the State Lounge was not to take charge of the situation from his sergeant, but to ask Rourke for a full accounting of what had happened and what had been done, and to tell him, once he'd heard it, that he had handled every step of it correctly. That mattered a great deal to Rourke. He told me later, not because he needed the approval, but because it meant the decisions he'd made under pressure, without time to ask anyone's permission, were not going to be quietly unmade by someone senior to him now that the crisis had grown large enough to attract senior attention. It is a small thing, a captain backing his sergeant's judgment rather than second-guessing it in front of the people it concerned, and I have come to think it is one of the more important things that happened that whole morning, because it meant Rourke was free to keep doing what he was already doing rather than spend the next 3 hours defending himself. The same could not be said for everyone who arrived at Aldermere Field that morning, and it is here that I have to introduce a man I never much cared for, though I want to be fair to him too, because I do not think he was wrong about the law even if I think he was wrong about almost everything else. Undersecretary Aldous Penshaw served as the Crown Estate Office's senior legal counsel, a position that made him, in the ordinary run of things, a background figure entirely unknown to the public, the kind of man whose job exists precisely so that questions like the disposition of a deceased Queen Mother's estate get resolved correctly, on paper, in a manner that will withstand any future challenge. He was, by every account I've since gathered, extremely good at that job. He was also, in Rourke's own words to me, a man who had spent so long thinking about how the rules protected the Crown that he had genuinely stopped being able to imagine that the Crown was made up of actual people. And when he arrived at Aldermere Field a little after 8 that morning, having been roused by a call from Adeline Fay's own superior, he brought with him a view of the situation that was, on its own narrow terms, entirely defensible and in every practical sense. A disaster waiting to happen. He met Rourke, Captain Bell, and by then, a visibly exhausted Adeline Fay herself in the state lounge, and he laid out, in the flat, precise language of a man reading from his own mental brief, exactly what he believed the law required. That 2 items of significant value had been removed from a probate estate without authorization by 2 different members of the royal house on the same night. That one of those items had already left the kingdom's own vault and traveled, in the physical custody of the queen consort, to the edge of an active departure. That the correct and, in his view, the only procedurally sound response was formal detention of both parties pending a full inquiry, a public statement from the palace confirming that an internal theft investigation was underway, and referral of the matter to the kingdom's own prosecutorial office for a determination of whether criminal charges were warranted. "I understand this is uncomfortable," Pinchot said. Rourke remembered the phrase precisely, because he found it such a strange word for what was happening to a grieving family in front of a fence line full of cameras. "But the law does not have a separate procedure for people who are sorry. If we treat this any more gently than we would treat an ordinary member of the household staff caught in identical circumstances, we have effectively announced that the law bends for the powerful. I would remind everyone in this room that we are being watched very closely right now, by a great many people who would be delighted to report exactly that." I want to be fair to Pinchot, because I think there is a real argument buried in what he said, and it is not a foolish one. Sergeant Rourke himself told me, years later, that Pinchot's underlying point, that the rule has to mean the same thing for everyone, or it isn't a rule, was in fact the very principle he had run across that apron believing in himself. The difference, and it was the difference that mattered, was that Pinchot believed sameness required identical severity in every case, while Rourke believed sameness required identical care. That the correct, even-handed response to a first-time, self-disclosed, fully recovered removal of family property from a family's own private estate was not automatically the same correct response owed to a calculated theft from a stranger, and that treating them as though they required identical punishment was not fairness at all, but a different kind of unfairness dressed up as principle. He said as much, carefully, in that room, and I think it is worth setting down close to exactly what he said, because I have heard him say versions of it many times since, and I believe it is close to the center of the man. "Undersecretary, I agree completely that the law can't bend for a title," Rourke said. "I would not be standing in this room if I believed otherwise. I stopped that aircraft on that exact principle, with nothing more than a ledger entry to go on, knowing it could end my career if I was wrong. But I don't think the law you're describing exists anywhere except in your own reading of it. Every procedure I have ever been trained under gives real weight to whether an item was recovered, whether it was disclosed rather than concealed, and whether the person involved cooperated the moment they were asked to. The queen consort met me at that door and handed me the case herself, unprompted, the moment her own companion suggested it. That is not nothing. If the law truly makes no room for that difference, then I think the law is wrong, and I am willing to say so to whoever needs to hear it. But I don't believe that's actually the law you're standing on. I do not know whether that argument alone would have been enough to change anything, and Rourke has always been honest with me that he doesn't know either. What changed the room in the end was not a legal argument at all. It was the sound of a young woman's voice in the corridor outside, raised in a way that none of the people in that lounge had expected to hear that morning, demanding to be let in to see her mother. Lady Verena had arrived at Aldermere Field. I saw her car myself. From the far side of the fence I was by then confined behind, a plain sedan without escort that had evidently been driven by Verena's own fiancé, the naval officer the family liked so well, at a speed that had brought it through the perimeter gate faster than our own security staff generally allowed. She had heard, I later learned, from a friend who had seen the first bulletin and, not knowing any better, had sent it to her with nothing more than a worried question mark. And Verena, 24 years old, 3 weeks from her own wedding, with no way of knowing whether the words Queen Consort halted meant her mother had been hurt, arrested, or worse, had not waited for anyone in the palace's own communications office to call her back with the truth. She had simply gone. She came through the terminal at something close to a run, by the account of everyone who saw her, and it took two of Captain Bell's own men, positioned at the lounge's outer door specifically to manage exactly this kind of arrival, to explain to her, gently but firmly, that she could not simply walk in on a matter under active guard review. An explanation that Rourke told me he heard through the door, and that struck him, even in the middle of everything else he was managing that morning, as exactly the wrong way to speak to a frightened young woman who believed her mother might be in danger. He went to the door himself. "Lady Verena," he said, and I have this detail directly from him, because it is one of the few moments of that entire day he described to me more than once, in almost exactly the same words each time, which tells me something about how much it mattered to him. "Your mother is safe. She is not hurt. Nothing has happened to her that cannot be undone. I need you to hear that before anything else, because I think it's the only thing you actually came here to learn, and everything after it is going to be easier for you to hear once you know it." She stopped. He told me her whole body seemed to stop with the words, the particular collapse of tension that happens in a person who has been braced for the worst possible news and is told instead that the worst has not happened. And then, because she was her mother's daughter in more ways than the public ever gave her credit for, she asked the second question, the harder one, in a voice that had gone very quiet. "Then what has happened?" I do not think Rourke had planned, walking to that door, to tell her the truth before he had told anyone else outside that room. But he made a judgment, standing there, that I think was exactly right, and that I have never heard anyone, not Penshaw, not the estate office, not even, eventually, King Alaric himself, seriously dispute afterward. He judged that Verena was not a member of the public, not a piece of the story, but the one person in the entire kingdom whose understanding of what her grandmother had actually wanted might matter more than any ledger entry, and that keeping her in ignorance in a corridor while men debated her mother's fate in a room she couldn't enter was its own kind of cruelty, regardless of procedure. "Your grandmother told your mother near the end that she wanted you to have the Harrogate star before your wedding," he said. "Your mother tried to carry that out the wrong way without authorization, and I stopped her before the aircraft left the ground. The item is safe. It has not left the kingdom. Nothing has been lost. But there is a second matter as well, one that does not involve you or your mother directly, and I am not in a position to say more about it yet." I want to pause on that last sentence, because it is, in its way, as important as anything else he did that morning. He told Verena the truth about her mother's situation because he judged she had a right to it, and because withholding it served no one. He did not tell her about Cassius, because that was not yet confirmed, was not yet his to share, and involved a second family member's private shame that had nothing to do with the question she had actually come to ask. That distinction between the truth a frightened person is owed and the truth that belongs to someone else's private reckoning is not written down in any guard manual I have ever heard of. It is simply a form of judgment, and it is, I have come to believe, the rarest and most valuable thing a man in Rourke's position can possess. Verena was permitted into the lounge a few minutes later, over what I understand was a brief but real objection from Undersecretary Penshaw, who felt, not unreasonably by his own lights, that adding a second emotional family member to an already fraught legal negotiation was precisely the kind of thing procedure existed to prevent. Captain Bell overruled him, on the simple ground that the Queen Consort had asked to see her daughter, and that there was, in his judgment, no security reason good enough to refuse her. What happened inside that room over the following 20 minutes, I have only in fragments from Rourke, who was present throughout, and once, much later, from Morwenna herself, who described it to me in far fewer words than I suspect the moment actually contained. Verena went to her mother and held her, for what Rourke estimated was close to a full minute, neither of them speaking, in the particular way people hold each other when a great deal has almost gone wrong and has not, in the end, quite gone wrong enough to need forgiving. And then Verena, drawing back, asked to see it, the Star, and Rourke, at Morwenna's nod, opened the case one more time. "She told me once," Verena said, looking at it, "that she used to hold it when she couldn't sleep, just hold it in her hand in the dark and think about her own mother. She told me that the last time I visited her, about 6 weeks before she died, I didn't know she'd said anything to you about giving it to me. I would have—" She stopped, and did not finish the sentence, and Rourke told me he had the distinct sense that whatever she had been about to say, she had decided in that room that it did not need saying aloud in front of Undersecretary Penshaw, and that some things are better carried privately between a mother and a daughter than spoken into a room with a legal counsel in it. It was into this room, roughly 40 minutes later, that the second piece of that morning's reckoning arrived, in the person of Lord Cassius himself, who had been reached by a call from Captain Bell's own office a little after 8, a call that Rourke insisted on making personally rather than delegating to anyone else, on the grounds that a young man was about to learn, over the telephone, that his private shame had become a matter of Crown Estate procedure on the single worst possible morning for it to happen, and that if anyone was going to deliver that news, it ought to be the same man who had already shown his mother the particular kind of restraint that made the news survivable. Cassius arrived at Aldermere Field a little before 9, and I saw him myself from the fence, though I did not yet know who he was, a tall young man in a plain coat, moving quickly from a car to the terminal entrance with his head down against a wall of cameras that had, by then, multiplied to a size I had genuinely never seen at that field before or have seen since, not for a state funeral, not for the arrival of a foreign head of state, nothing. I counted, at one point that morning, 11 separate television crews along a fence line built to comfortably hold perhaps 4, and a crowd behind them of ordinary travelers and passers-by, and the simply curious that our own security estimate, filed later that week, put it close to 300 people, a number that still strikes me as extraordinary for a field as modest as ours. What happened when Cassius entered that small lounge, I have second-hand from Rourke, who watched it happen and who told me, of everything he witnessed that entire day, this was the part that stayed with him longest. Cassius did not deny it. He came in already knowing, from Captain Bell's call, that the pocket watch had been found missing and traced to him, and rather than construct any kind of defense, he simply stood in the doorway and said, to his mother rather than to anyone official in the room, "I am so sorry. I did not know you were there that same night. I would never have let you carry any of this alone if I'd known." And Morwenna, who had spent the previous 3 hours absorbing Undersecretary Penshaw's careful legal arguments about theft and procedure, and the equal application of the law with a composure that had visibly cost her everything she had, looked at her son standing in that doorway, and for the first time all morning, according to Rourke, allowed herself to cry, not from fear of what might happen to either of them, but, Rourke believed, from something closer to recognition. That her own son had spent 18 months carrying a private debt he was too ashamed to bring to his own mother, in a family that had somehow, between the two of them, produced an entire night in which a mother and a son had each gone alone, separately, to the same vault, for their own separate reasons, neither one able to imagine that the other might understand. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked him, and Rourke told me that of everything said in that room across 3 difficult hours, that single question was the one that seemed to hang longest in the air before anyone answered it. "Because you would have paid it," Cassius said, "and I have watched you spend 20 years being made to feel like you had to earn your place in this family every single day. I was not going to be one more thing you had to buy your way through. I do not know what to tell you about a moment like that except that it is, in my experience, the truest kind of family trouble there is, not villainy, not greed, but two people so afraid of being a burden to each other that they each, independently, chose a private and unlawful shortcut rather than simply asking for help, and ended up, through no plan of either one, doing it on the very same night in the very same vault and getting caught by the very same ledger. Undersecretary Penshaw, to his credit, did not interrupt that exchange, though Rourke told me he watched the man's face throughout it, and could not tell whether what he was seeing was discomfort at witnessing something so private, or the beginning of a recalculation of exactly the kind Rourke had been hoping for since the moment he opened the lounge door to Verena. It was Captain Bell who finally spoke, once the room had settled, and what he said was the thing that finally moved the morning out of the small lounge and toward its resolution. "I think," he said, "that this has gone well past the point where anyone in this room has the authority to decide how it ends. I am going to call the palace." Word reached King Alaric at 9:20 that morning, in his own study, the same room, Rourke would learn afterward, in which the argument with Morwenna had taken place the night before, the portrait of his own mother still hanging above the mantel, and by 9:40, a crown vehicle carrying the King of Eldermore himself was moving toward Aldermere Field at a speed that our own control tower would later describe, in the dry language of an official incident log, as expedited. I remember, standing at the fence with the rest of the crowd that had gathered by then, the particular quality of the silence that fell over that whole field when word passed along the rail. Nobody could have said exactly how. The way these things simply travel through a crowd like weather, that the king himself was on his way. Even the cameras seemed to still for a moment. I have thought about that stillness a great deal since. A field that had spent 3 hours in mounting disorder, engines and vans, and a crowd of 300 straining against a fence, went, for one long breath, almost completely quiet, the way a room goes quiet when everyone in it understands, all at once, that whatever happens next is going to be the only thing anyone remembers about that morning. King Alaric's car came through the perimeter gate at 10:10, and I want to tell you plainly that I had seen him arrive at that field perhaps a dozen times over the years, always with the same unhurried, practiced calm that a lifetime of public appearances teaches a monarch to wear the way another man wears a coat. He did not have that calm that morning. I was close enough by then that our own security had allowed the fence line crowd a clear sight line down the access road, rather than trying, hopelessly, to disperse 300 people who had no intention of leaving, and I watched him come out of that car already moving, already speaking to the aide beside him, in a manner I had genuinely never seen from him before, not undignified, never that, but urgent. A man walking like someone who understood that every minute that passed while he was still in a corridor was a minute in which his own family's private grief kept turning, out on that fence line, into public spectacle. He did not go first to the state lounge. Sergeant Rourke met him at the terminal's side entrance, at Captain Bell's direction, because Bell judged, correctly, as it turned out, that the king would want a full and honest account from the one man who had been present at every stage of the morning, before he walked into a room full of his own family and Undersecretary Penshaw's careful legal language. I do not have this next part from Rourke's memory alone. I have it partly from him and partly, years later, from Alaric's own private secretary, who mentioned it to me once at a dinner neither of us expected to end up discussing that morning, and the two accounts agree closely enough that I trust the shape of it. "Tell me everything," Alaric said. "Not the version for the record, the truth, all of it quickly." Rourke told him. He told him about the 4:30 phone call and the run across the apron, about the case handed over on the airstairs, about the Star and Rosalind's private wish and Verena's unphotographed visits through her grandmother's last illness. He told him about the second ledger entry, about Cassius and the debts, and the pocket watch, about the exchange between mother and son that he had witnessed in the lounge less than an hour before. And he told him last, because he judged the king needed to hear it before he judged how to weigh anything Penshaw was about to tell him, exactly what Undersecretary Penshaw had argued, and exactly what he, Rourke, had argued back. Alaric listened to the whole of it without once interrupting, which I am told was itself unusual for him in a crisis. And when Rourke finished, he asked him one question that Rourke told me he had turned over in his mind many times since, because he thought it revealed more about the kind of king Alaric actually was than anything else that happened that day. "Sergeant, if I had not come, if it had been left entirely to you and to Undersecretary Penshaw to decide between yourselves how this ended, what would you have done?" Rourke told me he answered honestly, because he could see no reason not to. "I would have recommended against detention for either of them, sir. I would have recommended the item be returned to proper process, with an expedited claims review given the wedding date, and I would have recommended that whatever consequence Lord Cassius faces for his debts be handled as a private family and financial matter rather than a criminal one, provided the watch itself is returned and no further items are found missing. I believe that is the correct outcome under the same procedures Undersecretary Penshaw is citing, sir, not an exception to them. I do not believe I would be recommending anything different if this had happened to a groundskeeper's family instead of yours. That is the honest answer, and I understand you may not agree with it." "I did not ask whether I would agree with it," Alaric said. "I asked what you would have done." "Those are different questions, Sergeant, and I would like you to remember for the rest of your career that they are different questions." And then, Rourke told me, the king said something that he has repeated to me more than once over the years since, in something close to exactly these words. "You ran across an open apron on the strength of a 4:30 phone call, knowing it might end your career, because you believed it was the correct thing to do regardless of who stood at the other end of that run. I have spent this whole morning in a car being told by a great many frightened people what I ought to say to the cameras waiting outside that fence. You are the first person today who has told me what is actually true. I intend to remember that." I do not know exactly what was said in the state lounge over the following half hour, because Alaric asked to see his family privately, with only Captain Bell and, briefly, Rourke himself present at the king's own request. A request that told me, when I later learned of it, everything I needed to know about how completely Alaric had come to trust the judgment of a sergeant he had, before that morning, likely never exchanged more than a formal greeting with in his life. What I do know, because it became public within the hour and remains public record to this day, is the shape of what King Alaric decided, and I think it is worth setting down plainly, because it is the part of this story that I believe answers, better than anything else could, the question of what kind of institution the Royal House of Harrogate actually was underneath everything the newspapers made of that morning. He did not order any prosecution. He directed the Crown Estate Office, in a formal instruction issued that same afternoon over his own signature, to open an expedited claims review of the Harrogate Star, specifically on the grounds of Queen Mother Rosalind's documented private wish, with a target resolution before Lady Verana's wedding 3 weeks hence. A resolution that arrived in the end, 11 days later, when the estate office's own probate committee, having heard testimony from Ivan Sorrel and reviewed Rosalind's private correspondence for corroborating evidence of her intent, formally released the pendant into Verana's possession, through entirely lawful and entirely unremarkable channels, exactly as it should have happened from the beginning, had a difficult conversation the night before gone differently. As for Lord Cassius, the king's decision was quieter and, in its way, harder for Cassius himself to hear than any public consequence might have been. The pocket watch was returned to the estate that same day. His debts, a sum that would eventually be reported, not entirely accurately, at several times its true value, were addressed through a private arrangement with the family trust that oversaw his own income, structured at Alaric's insistence, not as a gift, but as a loan he would spend the following several years repaying through a reduced allowance, alongside a condition that surprised nearly everyone who later learned of it. That Cassius take up, for the first time in his adult life, a real and regular position within the Crown Estate's own charitable administration, managing a modest fund for young men in the kingdom, facing exactly the kind of private financial trouble he himself had been too ashamed to admit to his own family. I am told by people closer to the family than I will ever be that he still holds that position today, and that he is, by every account, unexpectedly good at it. None of that, of course, was visible to the crowd of 300 still pressed against the fence at 10:30 that morning, watching a terminal building and waiting for anyone, to come out and tell them what had actually happened. And it is here, at last, that I want to bring you to the moment I think most people who remember that day actually remember. Not the run across the apron, not the air stairs, not anything that happened behind the closed doors of the State Lounge, but the 10 minutes that followed, out on the open concrete in front of the terminal, in full view of 11 television crews and a fence line packed shoulder to shoulder, when the whole of that morning finally became, for everyone watching, a single visible scene, rather than a rumor pieced together from bulletins. King Alaric came out of the terminal himself, a little before 11, with Queen Consort Morwenna beside him. Not behind him, not shielded from view, but beside him, her hand resting lightly on his arm, in a manner so plainly deliberate that I do not believe anyone who saw it, including the most cynical reporters along that fence, mistook it for anything other than exactly what it was. A king choosing, in front of the entire kingdom, to stand publicly with his wife, rather than let her walk out of that terminal alone to face whatever the crowd made of her. Sergeant Rourke walked one step behind them, as was proper, cap under his arm, the same posture he had held on the air stairs 5 hours before, and I remember thinking, watching him cross that same stretch of concrete he had sprinted across at dawn, that there could not be a stranger or more fitting bookend to that entire morning than watching the same man make the same walk at an entirely different pace, for an entirely different reason. Alaric did not read from any prepared statement. His private secretary told me, years later, that there had been a draft, hastily assembled by the palace's communications staff in the 40 minutes since his arrival, and that he had looked at it once, in the car on the way out to the concrete, and set it aside without using a word of it. "There has been a difficult morning in my family," he said, and his voice, though not raised, carried clearly enough across that quiet fence line that I did not need to read a single word of it in a newspaper the next day to know exactly what he'd said. It began with grief, and it very nearly ended in something a great deal worse than grief, and I do not intend to stand here and pretend to you that nothing happened, because you have all been watching it happen since before dawn, and I owe you more respect than a denial. My mother, whom many of you loved as I loved her, left behind, among a great many other things, a piece of jewelry she wished, privately and without formal record, to see given to my daughter-in-law's sister on the occasion of her wedding. He paused briefly, and I have always believed, though I cannot prove it, that the small correction in his own family relations, calling Verena by a title of closeness rather than the more distant my wife's daughter, was as deliberate as everything else about that morning had been. My wife tried to see that wish honored last night in a manner that was not correct, and this morning one of my own guard stopped her, at real risk to his own position, because he believed, rightly, that the correct way mattered as much as the wish itself. I want the kingdom to know that he was right to do it, and that I am grateful to him, and that the matter has been resolved this morning through the same proper channels that should have been used from the start. There will be no prosecution of my wife or of my son, because there is nothing here that required one, only a family in a difficult year, trying to honor someone we lost, and getting the manner of it wrong before a good man corrected us. I would ask that you extend to my family this morning, the same grace I hope any of you would want extended to your own. I do not know how to describe to you the sound that fence line made in the silence after he finished, except to say that it was not the sound of a scandal. It was closer, I have always thought, to the sound a crowd makes at the end of something sad but true, not cheering, not exactly, but a kind of low, moved murmur that ran the length of that whole packed rail. Cameras still clicking, but somehow in that moment, feeling less like an intrusion than like witness. Sergeant Rourke did not step forward to take any part of that moment for himself. I want you to understand that clearly, because I think it is the truest measure of the man, more than anything else I have told you. He stood exactly where a guard sergeant is meant to stand, one respectful pace behind the king, cap under his arm, eyes forward, saying nothing, while the king of Eldermore told an entire kingdom that this man had been right. I watched him from the fence in that whole stretch of minutes, and his face did not change at all, not with pride, not with relief, not with anything I could read from that distance. He simply stood there the way he had stood on every ordinary post he had ever held, as though being publicly credited by his king for the single most consequential morning of his career was, to him, no different in substance from any other duty correctly performed. I found out much later that it very nearly wasn't the last thing that happened that morning after all, that Queen Consort Morwenna, before she and Alaric returned to the car that would take them back to the palace, stepped away from her husband's side for perhaps 20 seconds, crossed the short distance to where Rourke stood, and said something to him directly, quietly, that no camera along that fence line was positioned to catch clearly, and that he did not repeat to anyone, so far as I know. Until he told me, years afterward, sitting across from me at a pub table with 2 beers going warm between us. "You could have let that door close," she said to him. 30 more seconds and none of this happens the way it happened. I would have been in the air, and by the time anyone caught up to what I'd done, it would have been so much worse than this, for Verena, for Cassius, for all of us. You did not have to run as hard as you ran, Sergeant. Most men in your position would have found a reason to be 30 seconds too late. I didn't have 30 seconds to spare for finding a reason, ma'am, Rourke told her, and he told me he meant it exactly as simply as it sounded. No modesty performed, no speech prepared, just a plain answer from a man who had, in fact, run as hard as he had ever run in his life because it had not once occurred to him to run any slower. "Then I am glad," she said, "that it was you who answered the telephone this morning and not some other man." And then she went back to her husband's side, and the car doors closed, and the crowd along the fence began, in the slow way crowds do, to loosen and drift and eventually disperse, the vans folding their masts one by one, the reporters filing their final stories, the whole enormous machinery of that morning's attention beginning, at last, to wind down. It took me the better part of that whole day, just to get my own patch of concrete back into working order. 4 delayed departures, a stranded charter that eventually had to be rebooked entirely, a fuel schedule thrown so far off that we were still catching up on it 2 days later, and a stack of paperwork documenting a morning's worth of disruption that I do not believe any ramp supervisor at Aldermere Field has matched, before or since. I did not think, wrestling a tug back into its bay a little after 6 that evening, with my whole body aching from a day spent on my feet, that I had witnessed anything more than an unusually bad shift. It took the newspapers the following morning, and then the following week, and then, in a smaller and steadier way, the following months, to show me what I had actually been standing 40 yards from at 6:04 that morning. I want to tell you what became of the people in this story, because I think you are owed the fuller ending, and because I have had the good fortune in the years since of learning most of it firsthand. Lady Verena wore the Harrogate star at her wedding 3 weeks later, on a chain shortened slightly to sit at her throat rather than her grandmother's, in a ceremony that the palace kept, at the family's own request, considerably smaller and quieter than the public might have expected after everything that had happened at Aldermere Field that summer. I was not there, of course. Men who marshal aircraft are not generally invited to royal weddings. But I saw the photographs afterward in every paper in the kingdom, and I will admit that I looked longest at the one of Verena standing beside her mother before the ceremony, the sapphire catching the light at her collarbone, both of them smiling in the particular unguarded way people smile when a long, hard year has finally actually arrived at something good. Queen Consort Morwenna gave a brief interview to a single approved journalist some months later, the only time she ever spoke publicly about that morning at any length, in which she said, of the whole affair, only that she had learned the difference between honoring someone you loved and honoring the memory you had built of what she wanted, and that she was grateful, every day since, that a young sergeant had stopped her before she'd had to learn that lesson in a way that could never be undone. Lord Cassius, as I told you, took up his position with the estate charity fund, and has, by every report I have heard over the years, made something genuinely useful of it. I am told there is now a modest annual grant, quietly administered, available to young people across the kingdom facing the kind of private financial trouble that once drove him, at 2 in the morning, to a vault he had no right to enter. He does not speak publicly about that summer, and I have never heard that anyone in the family holds it against him that he doesn't. King Alaric and Queen Consort Morwenna, so far as I have ever been able to observe from the considerable distance a ramp supervisor keeps from a royal marriage, seemed, if anything, steadier in the years that followed than they had been before. I have no way of knowing what passed between them in private, but I have marshaled her aircraft a good many times since that morning, and I noticed, within a year or two, that she had taken to stopping at the bottom of the air stairs, the way her mother-in-law once did, to say a word or two to whichever ground crewman happened to be standing nearest. I do not know if that habit means what I think it means. I have chosen to believe that it does. As for Sergeant Halden Rourke, he was promoted within the year to lieutenant, and again, some years after that, to the captaincy. Captain Bell himself would eventually vacate on his own retirement, a career trajectory that surprised no one who had watched him handle that single morning, and that Rourke himself has always insisted, whenever I have raised it with him, had far less to do with what happened at Aldermere Field than with 12 years of unglamorous, unwitnessed correctness that simply happened, that one time, to be witnessed by a great many people at once. I do not entirely believe him when he says that, though I understand why a man like him would want to believe it. I think what happened that morning was not luck finding a competent man in the right place. I think it was exactly what happens when a person spends a whole career quietly deciding, in 10,000 small unwatched moments, to do the correct thing rather than the easy one, until the morning finally comes when the whole kingdom is watching, and there is nothing left to do but the same thing he would have done anyway. He and I have stayed friends, in the loose, comfortable way two men who shared one extraordinary morning tend to stay friends across the years that follow it. A pub table 2 or 3 times a year. A phone call when one of us reads something in the paper that reminds us of the other. He came to my retirement dinner 4 years ago now and stood up, without my asking him to, and told the room a version of that morning that made me sound a good deal braver than I actually was, standing 40 yards off a wingtip with a radio log in my hand, mostly just trying to stay out of everyone's way. I did not do anything heroic that day. I want to be honest about that because I think it matters at the end of a story like this one to be clear about what kind of witness I actually was. I did not stop an aircraft. I did not run across an open apron on the strength of a 4:30 phone call, knowing it might cost me everything. I marshaled a few aircraft to holding positions that should have been routine and were not, kept a radio log out of an old habit I never fully explained even to myself, and watched, from a respectful distance, while a better man than most I have known did his duty calmly, correctly, and without once raising his voice, on the single strangest morning of a working life I had, until then, believed held no more surprises for me. I have thought a great deal in the years since about what actually made that morning remarkable, because on its surface it was a story about jewelry and debts, and a family's private grief spilling out in public, the kind of thing that fills newspaper columns for a week and is mostly forgotten within a year. But I do not think that is what people actually remember about it, and I do not think it is what I remember most, either. What I remember is a man climbing a set of air stairs with his cap in the crook of his arm, offering a frightened woman a choice she had no obligation to be given, and holding, through 6 hours of mounting chaos and a legal counsel's cold procedural certainty, an offense line packed 300 deep with cameras, to the same quiet, unshowy correctness he had carried onto that apron in the first light of dawn. He never once raised his voice. He never once made a woman who had made a painful mistake feel smaller than the mistake required. He simply did, over and over, across the worst morning of several people's lives, the next correct thing, and then the next one after that, until a kingdom that could easily have watched a scandal instead watched something that looked, by the end of it, very much like grace. I am an old man now, retired these 4 years from a career I loved on a small stretch of concrete outside a kingdom's capital, and I have watched a great many aircraft come and go across that field in 31 years of service, kings arriving in state, coffins loaded in silence, a prime minister's plane diverted for nothing at all. But when people ask me, as they still sometimes do, what the most remarkable thing was that I ever saw from the cab of that tug, I do not tell them about the size of the crowd, or the number of camera crews, or even the king's own words on that stretch of open concrete at 11 o'clock that morning. I tell them about a sergeant running full out across 400 yards of apron at dawn, and a set of air stairs already folding shut, and a door that opened anyway, because a good man knocked on it and asked, quietly, for the chance to make things right before they became impossible to fix. That is the whole of what I saw that morning, when you strip away everything else. A man who did not need to be told the rules applied to everyone. He had simply always believed it, long before anyone was watching, and on the one morning the whole kingdom happened to be watching at once, that belief was the only thing that mattered at all.